Welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most powerful and popular openings in chess, the Sicilian Defence. If you want to counter e4 with sharp, aggressive play and fight for the win right from the start, this is the opening for you. Let's see how it works. The Sicilian Defence arises from you responding with pawn to c5. And the first purpose of the c5 move is to control the d4 square so that white cannot now play pawn to d4 himself, and build up those beautiful pawns in the center of the board. Now, after pawn to d4, there are certainly a few main ways for white to continue. Usually the main line is the so-called open Sicilian. It is when white plays knight to f3, getting ready to play pawn to d4 on the next turn. And here, let's say you go pawn to d6 to control the center and to open up the diagonal for your bishop. Then white goes pawn to d4. It is called an open Sicilian because white breaks open the center, opening up a lot of diagonals and files for his pieces, and that is why it is called an open Sicilian. Now, why did white need to have this knight on f3? Because after the trade, white does not want to recapture with the queen. In general, in chess, you do not want to expose your queen early in the game to attacks. That is why white wants to have this knight right here, so that white can recapture with a knight. And now white indeed has some advantage in the middle of the board. But black also has this semi-open c-file and his own counter chances. Now black usually goes knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4 and developing the knight. White plays knight to c3, also developing and guarding the pawn. And from here we get a variety of options that black can choose from. The most played option here is pawn to a6, known as the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian Defence. There is also the dragon variation, which is really aggressive, and the classical variation with knight to c6. These are the most popular options, and we are going to talk about them one by one. The Najdorf variation is characterized by black playing pawn to a6. This was the favorite opening weapon of Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov. The move pawn to a6 serves multiple purposes. First, it covers the b5 square so that white cannot place a bishop or a knight there. In addition, if black later plays queen to c7, which often happens, this pawn also secures the queen from potential attacks. That is the defensive role of this move, but it also carries an aggressive idea. It prepares the possibility of pushing the b-pawn forward to b5 later in the game, and then from there, I will just play some random move for white to illustrate the purpose. If black goes pawn to b5, you can see that this pawn can possibly harass the white knight, and by doing so, it also threatens the pawn in the middle of the board. In addition, this pawn push allows black to fianchetto the bishop on b7, placing it on the long diagonal where it can exert strong pressure. So, that is the aggressive idea behind the seemingly small move pawn to a6. Now, back to the real theory. White certainly has different ways to play here. Usually, white will develop one of the bishops, either the light-squared bishop or the dark-squared bishop, and typically against the Sicilian Defence, it is considered most dangerous for black if white tries to castle on the queenside. Why is that? Because, of course, white can play modest development moves, bringing out the pieces, castling kingside, and so on. That is perfectly fine, but it does not really create immediate threats for black. Black can simply continue with whatever plan they choose. That is why, if white wants to attack and play more aggressively, they often choose to quickly develop their queenside pieces, castle queenside, and then expand with pawns on the kingside to launch an attack. Since this attacking plan is so straightforward and powerful, a lot of players really enjoy playing this way against the Sicilian. Now, what can you do about that? Well, the classical response for black is to play pawn to a5. The beauty of the Najdorf variation is that it is very flexible. You can decide the right setup depending on what your opponent chooses. And here, since we know that white is going to be aggressive, black can also try to be more active. By playing pawn to a5, you push the white knight out of the center and gain more space for yourself. Then, usually black develops with bishop to e6, continues with bishop to e7, castles kingside, and brings the other knight to d7. That is the typical setup black plays. From there, we reach a very complex middle game position. White will usually continue with their plan and castle queenside. Now we have opposite side castling. White is likely to expand on the king side, while black will be pushing pawns on the queen side. As always in the Sicilian Defence, black also has this beautiful semi-open c-file for the rook, which will support the queenside attack. And from here, we can expect a sharp and exciting battle. The next variation of the Sicilian Defence is the dragon variation. Instead of leaving your dark squared bishop blocked, you fianchetto it onto the long diagonal, where it can put constant pressure on white's position. The dragon is one of the sharpest lines in chess, perfect if you love attacking. White often responds with pawn to f3, a classical move that overprotects the center pawn and controls the g4 square, stopping black's pieces from jumping there. From here, the setup often looks similar to what we saw before, opposite side castling with both players launching pawn storms against the enemy king. Your dark squared bishop and the semi-open c-file give you excellent attacking chances, while white also has a very clear and dangerous plan of their own. In the dragon, white's typical plan is very direct. They push pawn to h4 to h5 to open the h-file for their rook, and then play bishop to h6 to trade off your dark squared bishop, the key defender of your king. Combined, this gives white a very simple and dangerous attacking plan. That's why the dragon is often considered risky for black and slightly more favorable for white. That being said, most white players only know the basics of this attack. If you study the dragon more deeply, you can gain a serious edge and punish opponents who rely only on surface knowledge. Moving on, there is also the classical variation. Here, black avoids early pawn moves and simply develops with knight to c6. It makes perfect sense. Develop your pieces first. The main reply from white is bishop to g5, putting pressure on the knight with the idea of possibly doubling black's pawns. From there, white's plan often remains the same. Queen to d2, castle queenside, and launch a kingside attack, quite similar to the previous variations. In reality, the most common move for white here is bishop to e3, aiming for the same setup with queen to d2, pawn to f3, and queenside castling. But here, black has a clever trap. Play knight to g4, attacking the bishop. If white captures, their pawn structure collapses, so usually they move the bishop away. Then comes queen to b6, creating a double attack on the knight at d4. And the trick is, if that knight moves or capture on c6 instead of recapturing, black can unleash a sudden checkmate. There is also a more modern and aggressive option called the Sveshnikov variation. Instead of playing pawn to d6 and entering the classical, black immediately strikes with pawn to a5. In the past, this was thought to be a mistake because it weakens squares and leaves a backward pawn. But today it's recognized as a dynamic weapon. It pushes the knight away, grabs space, opens the diagonal for the bishop, and gives black active play. Now the first question you may be wondering is, what if white simply captures on c6? In the Sicilian Defence, this is almost never a good idea for white. Why? Because first, they are trading their most active piece, the centralized and advanced knight. Second, by doing so, they actually help black strengthen their control of the center. After black recaptures, the pawn from the queenside moves closer to the center, controlling important squares. Notice that now white can no longer jump forward with their knight. In the future, black may even break open the center with pawn to d5, completely taking over central control. On top of that, the capture gives black a useful semi-open file for the rook. So overall, if your opponent is willing to trade here, it actually benefits you. The usual and correct move for white instead is knight to b5, aiming to occupy the weak square on d6. Black covers it, and then white often plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight because they want to use the d5 square. But here black pushes pawn to a 6, forcing the knight back. It has no good squares to go to, so it retreats to a 3. After that, black plays pawn to b5, fully restricting the knight. It cannot return to c3, and soon black will push pawn to b4, harassing both knights at once. This makes it clear that white's knights are uncoordinated. The knight on c3 has a promising future heading toward d5, but the knight on a 3 is completely misplaced. It has nowhere to go, except possibly back to b1, which would be an absurd retreat after all the effort spent moving it forward. Meanwhile, black calmly continues development with bishop to e7, bishop to e6, and castles kingside. The result is an imbalanced position, giving both sides mutual chances but leaving black with excellent prospects. Thanks for watching.